Hello and welcome to another episode of The Record of Arms. I'm your host Mark Seven, and I'm glad to have you here for another talk about military history. Today we're going to continue with our examination of the German invasion of Poland in 1939. We've been examining the campaign through the lens of an account written as part of the U.S. Army study published in 1956. This study, titled The German Campaign in Poland, 1939, was written by Robert M. Kennedy, a major in the infantry. It was published as part of a pamphlet series, of which it is number 20-255. Thus, our account here can give an idea of the kind of lessons learned by the United States military as a result of the Second World War and more recently Korea. So far, the most noticeable, to me at least, has been the large amount of space devoted to describing logistical and administrative arrangements, especially in respect to German practice, as well as the attention given to command structures and the disposition of corps level and higher headquarters units. In previous episodes, we discussed the interwar experience of the two states, their armed forces, and the rearmament programs each conducted in the mid to late 1930s. We also looked at their political relationship to each other and to the larger European security system of the post-World War I era, and examined the graduated program of calculated aggrandizement undertaken by Germany once the National Socialist government came to power in 1933. In the last episode, we took a detailed look at the major topographical features of Poland and the characteristics of the land as a battlefield. We also examined the war plans and dispositions of forces that these called for on both sides. The German plan, which is known as Plan Weiss or Case White, called for a rapid, crushing attack on the Poles using the majority of their active duty army and air force. Only a limited mobilization of reserves in preparation for the invasion was to be undertaken, so as to limit the warning given of the blow to come. This meant that only slender forces would be available to man the defenses on the western frontier, the so-called Westfall, sometimes called the Siegfried Line. This made speed all the more essential, as Germany would be unable to hold off a serious attack by the French or British until subsequent waves of reservists could be organized. This meant that a vigorous western response would have to be met by pulling units from the Polish theater. The Poles, for their part, disposed their forces in a number of small armies, typically about 3 divisions in size, or about the size of a German corps. These were located throughout the western, southern, and central districts of the country, with large reserve formations behind the northwestern and southwestern fronts, as well as larger central reserve held in the vicinity of the capital. The Poles intended to hold the Germans as far west as possible, ahead of the relatively defensible river lines and permanent fortifications some distance back. The units assigned to the armies of the western frontier were directed to build fortifications in the zones under their control. The execution of these fortifications was left to the initiative of the local commanders, however, and as a result the quality, density, and soundness of these works varied widely. Some indeed were well-sited, mutually supporting permanent installations that would cause real trouble for an attacker. Those at Malowa, north of Warsaw, and in the fortified zone of Polish Silesia around Katowice and Seszyszała, consisted of dense, deep networks of heavy, reinforced concrete pillboxes and bunkers, as well as underground works and artillery. Others were simply regular field works, consisting of entrenchments and rifle pits, barbed wire obstacles, and tank traps. This forward defense posture was taken out of a desire to retain the most economically valuable parts of the country, the fertile territories of the corridor, the outlet to the Baltic Sea, and the industrial, mining, and metallurgical concentrations in the southwest around Krakow. This exposed large parts of the Polish army to the threat of encirclement by fast-moving German forces, but it was hoped that the guarantees of intervention made by the French and British would be honored, and that the invading Germans would be drawn off to deal with a greater threat in the west. Thus, it was hoped that the German attack need only be prevented from achieving a quick victory. The Poles intended to use their reserves to hold any breakthroughs the invaders may make in the defensive lines in the west. The central reserve around the capital, which included the majority of the small Polish armored formations, is also to be used as a counterattack force should the chance arise. As summer of 1939 progressed, the diplomatic situation worsened between the two countries, and propaganda efforts on both sides prepared the home populations for war and pled their cases before the public opinion of the foreign powers. Border incidents, most of them probably genuine, occurred from time to time, and the arsenals of both sides sent more and more weapons to the provinces of eastern Germany and western Poland. So, with this background in mind, let's pick up the story where we left it and take a look at how these plans discussed in the previous episode began to take shape once the path of war was chosen in August 1939. The first phase of German troop movements to the eastern frontier occurred through late June into early August. The movements involved most of the infantry divisions, some of the corps headquarters, and service units. These movements were undertaken well in advance of the planned operation in order to allow the service units to create the installations and communications network needed by the rest of the invasion force. It also allowed the Wehrmacht to rotate some of the early arriving units back to Germany once before sending them back to the Polish frontier closer to the presumptive Y-Day, another measure designed to dispel Polish suspicions and imply that peacetime routine was being maintained. The initial movements involved 4 infantry divisions sent to eastern Germany between the 26th of June and the 15th of July. 5 more were dispatched to join them in Silesia and Pomerania before the 4th of August. Troops were sent to the isolated province of East Prussia during the first phase of the concentration as well, with an infantry division and a panzer brigade joining the garrison there in the first week of August. This province was uniquely vulnerable to a Polish preemptive attack, especially if that attack should come during the early stages of the build-up. As a result of the relatively exposed strategic position of East Prussia, the German Third Army, in command of units there, is the only one of the Wehrmacht armies to maintain a headquarters staff in peacetime in order to facilitate a rapid transition to a wartime stance in case of attack across the Polish or Lithuanian borders. As August progressed, the deployments continued according to plan. In the north, 2 infantry divisions as well as elements of corps headquarters troops arrived to join 4th Army, while Signals Regiment set up a communications network for Army Group North. In the south, a total of 6 infantry divisions joined the 3 armies of Army Group South in mid-August. They were accompanied by corps headquarters troops and signals units as in the north, as well as engineer and construction units, most of which went to 10th Army, the largest of the southern armies, the one designated to make the main drive on Warsaw. Some elements of the Army Group level supporting units, namely communications personnel and military police, also arrived in the south. In mid-August, Hitler authorized the second phase of the build-up, taking another step on the road to war. This was designated Movement A. Staff personnel assigned to Army Group North were concentrated at Bad Polsen and established Army Group headquarters there. 4th Army headquarters was also established at this time at the town of Jastrow. Army Group level troops attached to the northern forces began arriving, such as engineers, signals, artillery, and dedicated squadrons of Army cooperation aircraft. 4th Army received much of its mechanized force, with the arrival of a panzer division and the leading elements of 2 motorized divisions, while 4 divisions of reservists in East Prussia were called to the colors. In the south, Movement A brought the bulk of 10th Army's mechanized force as well, the 2 panzer, 3 light mechanized, and 2 motorized infantry divisions moving into the area. Headquarters units were established for the 3 armies, with the 8th Army's headquarters at Breslau, 10th Army's at Oppeln, and 14th Army at Neutestein. Rundstedt's Army Group South headquarters was also established at Neisse, and corps headquarters units were also established throughout the southern operational area. On the 23rd, Hitler set the date for the invasion to begin, known as Y-Day, as the 26th. This set in motion the final movements of the concentration. The remaining elements of the armies in the north and south arrived and moved into their starting positions over the next 2 days. At this time, the mechanized force assigned to 14th Army arrived in its assembly areas. This consisted of 2 panzer and 1 light mechanized division. To maintain security, many of the armored or motorized units involved in this last phase proceeded to their assigned positions using their own transport, coming directly from the scene of maneuvers just being completed in central Germany. While these movements of army units were underway, the Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe were moving their assets into position to execute their parts of Plan Weisse and Plan West. Most of the naval dispositions were made against the possibility of British and French intervention in the West. On the 19th of August, 14 long-range U-boats left Wilhelmshaven and Kiel to take up patrol stations in British waters. They were followed in the next few days by surface and submarine forces sent into the Atlantic to raid Allied seaborne commerce in the event of war. These included some heavy units, such as the Panzerschiffe Graf Spee and the Deutschland. These big ships left their German bases on the 21st and 23rd respectively, to rendezvous with German supply ships waiting in the Atlantic. The Graf Spee was to meet the Altmark on its way to the South Atlantic, while the Deutschland was sent to meet the Westerwald in anticipation of a similar raiding mission into the Northern Atlantic. 2 more ocean-going U-boats also left for war stations in the Atlantic. The battleships Scharnhorst and Eisenau took up stations in the North Sea. These units were all under the command of Marine Group of West, which also retained the Admiral Scheer, the Admiral Hipper, the cruiser Leipzig, 3 divisions of destroyers, 24 of the smaller U-boats, as well as light forces for patrol and minesweeping, and about 100 naval aircraft. Naval forces assigned to direct participation in the attack on Poland were under the command of Marinegruppe Ost, which had the cruiser Emden as flagship. The command was assigned 2 cruisers, 2 flotillas of destroyers, 14 submarines, as well as a small force of light craft and naval aircraft. The pre-dreadnought battleship Schleswig-Holstein would also be sent to the east. As for the Luftwaffe, the 1st and 4th Luftflotten, or air forces, were assigned to the attack. The 1st made its headquarters in East Prussia and would operate in support of Army Group North. It controlled 800 aircraft. This included 500 bombers, mainly Heinkel HE-111s and Dornier Do-17s, both types that had seen considerable amount of combat over the previous 2 years as part of the Condor Legion in Spain. The 1st also had about 150 dive bombers and 120 fighters. The 4th Air Force, headquartered at Breslau, possessed about 600 planes and was tasked with the support of the Southern Advance. The 4th had about 300 bombers, 160 dive bombers, and 120 fighters. The remainder of the Luftwaffe, including about half of its fighter units, were retained in the west to act in defense of the home territory against a possible air attack from France or Britain. Luftwaffe reserves held for the east amounted to a few bomber units and 2 air groups with about 250 Ju-52 tri-mortar transport planes and a division of Fallschirmjägers, or paratroopers. Under the Wehrmacht concept of organization, airborne forces as well as the anti-aircraft artillery were operated by the Air Force. On the 23rd, the major commands, such as the Army groups and the Marine groups, were officially activated, and as the buildup of forces reached completion, the precise time for the attack to begin was set by Hitler as just before dawn on the 26th. Meanwhile, the mobilization for 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Wave reserve units was begun in Germany. This involved the call-up of Army and Luftwaffe personnel only, as no naval reinforcements were deemed necessary unless the Western powers decided to intervene. No further orders were now necessary for the attack to begin. However, Hitler decided to postpone the attack at the last minute as a result of Chamberlain's guarantees to the Poles. This was done late on the 25th, so late that many units were already on their way to their assault positions, and runners had to be dispatched to catch and halt some units. These were not always successful, as in a few cases small German units in fact crossed the border and engaged in firefights with Polish border forces. Border clashes and incursions all along the frontier were reported by both sides. Apparently the Poles considered this another round in the German war on nerves, and though the clashes between the two armies resulted in casualties, none resulted in a breaking out of hostilities. The Germans were still apparently hoping for another bloodless takeover like they had achieved in Czechoslovakia, while the Poles placed their hope in an Allied intervention on their behalf. As a result, the troops of both nations waited tensely under arms for the next few days. In the meantime, the delay allowed more German units to arrive and join the attack forces. For example, the newly constituted 10th Panzer Division joined Army Group North and was placed into Army Group Reserve. On the sea, 2 more ocean-going U-boats were dispatched into the Atlantic. German reconnaissance also revealed that 3 of the Polish destroyers, 4 of which made up the bulk of her surface fleet, had left the port of Gdynia and were headed for the British Isles. With no significant surface opposition in the east then, the 2 cruisers, 3 of the destroyers, and some of the torpedo boat units were withdrawn from Marinegruppe Ost and transferred to the Western Command. This left the German Navy in the east with only the battleship Schleswig-Holstein, a handful of destroyers, and a few light units, and about a dozen coastal submarines. The dictator's hesitation passed within a few days, and he resolved once more on the attack. Orders were issued on the 30th to the participating headquarters of the 3 services to prepare for operations to begin on the 1st. The next day, these orders were confirmed, and the attack was set to begin an hour before dawn on the 1st of September. The ground forces facing Poland totaled 55 divisions. The force actually assembled differed in some respects from the one outlined in Plan Weiss, mostly due to the arrival of additional units as a result of the week's postponement. Most of the extra units were added to the strength of northern armies. 21 Corps, mobilized as part of the second wave of reservists, was added to the 3rd Army. Also, a provisional command called Corps Rodrig after its commander was formed in East Prussia to take charge of 2 divisions during the move south towards Warsaw. The Panzer Brigade, brought into the province in the first week of August, was also beefed up into a provisional division. Army Group North had also received the newly created 10th Panzer Division, as mentioned above, as well as 19 Corps, an active duty command raised during the summer to control the mechanized portion of that army's forces. This 19 Corps was led by General der Panzertruppen Heinz Guderian. The Küstern Frontier Command, holding the German center, was redesignated the 50th Infantry Division. Little augmentation of Army Group South took place in the period between the 26th and launch of the attack. The exception was the addition of Wave 2 Corps to the 14th Army and the increased readiness of several of the Army's divisions, who would be able to enter action much sooner after the initiation of hostilities than would have been the case had the delay not occurred. Now we can turn to the exact deployment of the German armies. We'll begin with 3rd Army in East Prussia. On the left, facing the Lithuanian frontier, a small command was formed to hold the border. This was designated Corps Brand after its commanding officer, and was composed of 2 brigades of Frontier Command border troops. On the right, facing the corridor, 21 Corps stood with 2 infantry divisions, ready to advance westward into the corridor towards the town of Grzyaz to meet 4th Army troops advancing from Pomerania. The center of 3rd Army's line, facing south towards Warsaw, was assigned the bulk of the troops in East Prussia, that is, 4 infantry divisions and the Provisional Panzer Division. These forces were under the control of 1 Corps and Corps Woodrig, and were directed to prosecute the northern arm of the German advance on the capital. Cavalry Brigade in East Prussia was assigned to protect the left flank of this force. 3rd Army would also control the force of reservists at Danzig, designated Brigade Eberhard, who would seize the city from within. 3rd Army Reserve consisted of 1 infantry division, as well as the border troops of 11th Frontier Command. Frontier Command soldiers were paramilitary police and border troops, under the orders of the Ministry of the Interior, but placed under Army Command for the operation, in which they would be used to perform rear area security duties or to hold gaps in the line as the regular troops advanced. Opposite the corridor from East Prussia and Pomerania was the 4th Army, whose principal mission in the beginning of the invasion was to effect the junction of the main portion of Germany with the eastern province. On the far north of its front, opposite the ports of Gdynia and Danzig, the border troops of 1st Frontier Command were to advance the short distance across the upper end of the corridor and link up with the German forces in Danzig. South of this, the major units of 4th Army would operate. These were 19 Corps under Guderian, which is made up of 2 divisions of motorized infantry and a panzer division. South of 19 Corps were stationed 2 and 3 Corps, which were assigned 2 infantry divisions in the first case and an infantry division and a provisional brigade in the second. These 2 formations would advance on the right of the main drive carried out by the mobile units of 19 Corps, which would advance to meet the infantry of 21 Corps coming west from East Prussia at Grzyaz. Once the corridor was cut by this advance, the combined 3rd and 4th Armies would move in the direction of Warsaw. 4th Army Reserves, consisting of 2 infantry divisions and a panzer division, would be held behind the center of 4th Army's line. In the extreme south of Army Group North's area, that is, close to the center of the German line, more border troops of the 2nd and 12th Frontier Commands would hold the frontier area and form the junction with Rundstedt's command in the south. The 12th Frontier Command in particular was tasked with manning the strong fortifications in the regions just east of the junction of the Warta River and the Oder. Army Group North Reserves consisted of 1 infantry division in East Prussia, located near the meeting point of the Lithuanian, Polish, and East Prussian frontiers, as well as 2 infantry divisions and a panzer division in Pomerania, concentrated behind the center and right wing of 4th Army's line of deployment. Now we turn to the larger of the 2 striking forces and examine the 3 armies under Gerd von Rundstedt based in the southern provinces of Germany and in the newly acquired territory of Slovakia, deployed around the border of the southwestern corner of Polish territory. Smallest of these was 8th Army, deployed to the south of the Frontier Command units holding the center of the German line. The main body of 8th Army consisted of 2 infantry corps, each with 2 divisions. The center of 8th Army's front was held by 10 Corps, and the right flank, extending towards the 10th Army in the south, was manned by 13 Corps. The northern part of 8th Army's front, like the southern part of 4th Army's, was held by border troops of the 13th Frontier Command, which would maintain contact with 12th Frontier Command troops holding the extreme southern flank of Bach's forces in the north. 8th Army was assigned no reserve forces of its own. 10th Army was the largest of all the German armies employed in the invasion. It was tasked with the main drive towards Warsaw. It held the center of Army Group South's front. The left flank of 10th Army, which formed the junction with 8th Army, was held by 11 Corps, composed of 2 divisions of infantry. South of 11 Corps was the major striking force of the 10th Army, 16th Corps, led by General Hoepner, made up of 2 panzer and 2 infantry divisions. The southern portion of 10th Army's line would be covered by 4th Corps with 2 infantry divisions, and 15th Corps on the extreme right, fielding a single light mechanized division. 10th Army reserves were controlled by 14 Corps, and this consisted of mobile units, specifically 2 motorized infantry divisions and 2 light mechanized divisions. These forces were held in the area behind 10th Army's northern flank, and could be used to either counterattack a Polish advance or to exploit a breakthrough of their line. Further south, 14th Army faced Galicia and the southwestern provinces of the Polish Republic. The left flank, linking up with the forces of 10th Army, was held by the 8th Corps fielding 2 infantry and a panzer division. The center of 14th Army's line was held by 17 Corps with 3 divisions of infantry. To the south of this, manning the Carpathian border, was stationed 18th Corps with 1 panzer, 1 infantry, and 1 mountain infantry division. A small number of Slovakian units would operate on the extreme right flank, where they would operate in conjunction with German reconnaissance troops and be tasked with the capture and occupations of some towns and villages across the Polish border which were claimed by the Slovaks themselves. 14th Army had no reserve units of its own, but some elements, such as the 22nd Corps and a pair of mountain divisions, were still in the process of arriving in their assembly areas when the attack began, and would join the army later. Army Group South reserves consisted of 7 Corps with 1 infantry division, and 5 other infantry divisions. The reserve corps was to follow behind the advance of 10th Army, while the other 5 disattached divisions would be disposed behind the individual armies. 2 of these would be posted behind the junction of 8th and 10th Army, 1 behind 10th Army, and the other 2 behind the junction of 10th and 14th Armies. In terms of numbers of men, German forces in the east counted 630,000 in Army Group North and another 886,000 in Army Group South. Of those in the north, 320,000 were assigned to 3rd Army and 230,000 to the 4th, with another 80,000 assigned to Army Group level units and those under Central Army HQ control. In the south, 180,000 men marched with 8th Army, 300,000 with the 10th, and 210,000 as part of 14th Army. Troops under higher level commands in the south added another 196,000. Meanwhile, Plan West, manning of the western fortifications against a possible attack from that direction, was also progressing. Army Group C, which controlled the 3 armies in the west, was activated at the same time as its counterparts along the Polish frontier. The Army Group was put under the command of General Oberst Ritter von Lieb, who was recalled from retirement for this purpose. Lieb's forces consisted of 12 active-duty infantry divisions, along with 6 second-wave divisions of reservists. More reserve divisions would join his command as the mobilization progressed, with 12 coming in the 3rd wave and another 3 in the 4th. The ground forces would be supplemented by 2 Luftflotten, the 2nd covering the northern half of the frontier and the 3rd the south. These slender forces were in no way sufficient to hold back a determined French and British attack, making a quick decision in the east all the more imperative. The Poles were aware of the concentrations taking place, and the worsening diplomatic situation left them in little doubt about the probability of an attack from their western neighbor. The government ordered a general mobilization on the 30th. We have noted in the first episode of this series that the official casus belli came in the pre-dawn darkness of the 31st, when the so-called Gleiwitz incident occurred. This was a staged incursion of Polish troops over the German border. The supposed Polish troops, actually some of Himmler's SS men in Polish uniform, took over a radio station in the town and broadcast an announcement of an attack on Germany. The SS men then retreated in the face of oncoming police and border troops, leaving several casualties behind. These supposed Polish casualties were in fact Gestapo prisoners who had been dressed in Polish kit and shot, then dumped and left to be found. The storm broke the next morning. The battle opened in the air. At 4:40 hours, Luftwaffe units struck Polish airfields throughout the country. Around the same time, the battleships Schleswig-Holstein and Danzig Harbor began a close-range bombardment of the Polish fortress of Westerplatte and the waterfront. The Germans attempted to land a small force in the harbor under the cover of this bombardment, but this was beaten back by the Poles. Meanwhile, in Gdynia Harbor, the Polish destroyer Vicar was sunk during an attack by air and light surface forces, and a tight blockade of the short Polish coast was locked down. The majority of the Polish fleet, including the 3 other destroyers and the 5 operational submarines, left the area beforehand. The destroyers and the submarines Orzel and Vilk made for British waters, while the other 3 submarines headed to Sweden, where they were interned. Despite the clear indications of the coming war, the Germans still managed to achieve tactical surprise. Most of the Polish reserves were still on the way to their units, and the forces in the border region were caught flat-footed by the initial advance. All along the lines, the Germans brushed aside the small forces manning the borders themselves and pushed forward on schedule. At 1000 hours, Hitler announced the invasion to the Reichstag, which he had assembled in Berlin's Kroll Opera House. Referring to the Gleiwitz incident of the day before, he declared that the Poles had launched a coordinated attack on the Reich, and that the Wehrmacht was prosecuting the defense and counterattack against this blatant aggression. In the same speech, he reaffirmed his desire to remain at peace with the Western Allies. Finally, he declared that should he fall in the battle against the Poles, he was to be succeeded by the Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring. This last proviso, in which Hitler all but established a new ruling dynasty, indicates the degree to which the National Socialists had established their dominance over the German state and people. So now let's look at the operations of the opening days. We'll begin with Fedor von Bock's Army Group North. From East Prussia, 3rd Army began its twofold advance. Corps Rodrig and 1 Corps began to move south towards the capital, while 21 Corps struck southwestwards towards Grudziądz to meet up with the 4th Army and cut the base of the corridor. 4th Army, meanwhile, began its advance eastward, while on the coast, Brigade Eberhard seized the city of Danzig in a quick and bloodless coup. Rapid progress was made all along 3rd Army's front until the afternoon, when the divisions moving on Warsaw encountered stubborn resistance in the fortified area of Mlawa. Poles had their 8th and 20th Infantry Divisions in this area, as well as the Novogradska Cavalry Brigade. Attacks by German armor were broken up with considerable loss by well-directed fire of anti-tank artillery from the fortifications. Meanwhile, the 4th Army advanced rapidly eastward from Pomerania. The Pomorska Cavalry Brigade engaged the Germans in some scattered actions, but by noon it became apparent that the cavalrymen were covering the retreat of the rest of the Pomorska Army, which was pulling back to the south and east in front of the invaders. The fighting here was much lighter than the Germans had expected, as their intelligence estimates had placed stronger Polish forces in the corridor. The Poles could still make a stand behind the Berda River. It was believed by some Wehrmacht commanders that this was the Polish intention. At dawn the next day, a task force, called Kampfgruppe Medem, 3rd Army, which included a strong engineering component, seized the city of Dürschau on the Vistula. There was a bridge over the river here, but it had been demolished by the retreating Poles. The task force attempted to seize another crossing in the area, but was unable to effect this, and as a result, it was left to other units to effect crossing elsewhere at New and near the town of Marienwerder. On the same day, in the corridor, 21 Corps pushing eastward toward Grudziądz was hit by a strong Polish counterattack and forced onto the defensive. Artillery was brought up and kept the bridge over the Vistula in the town under fire, preventing the Poles from bringing up significant reinforcements. The Corps dug in outside the town and prepared for a systematic assault on the town from the north and east on the next day. On the Mlawa front, 1 Corps remained unable to break through the Polish fortifications. Corps Rodrig made a successful attack that broke through the entrenchments to the east of the city and pushed to the south. The armored element of 1 Corps was diverted to the east and directed to support Corps Rodrig in its advance. Along with the Corps, the tanks were directed to execute an enveloping movement to take the defenders of Mlawa from behind. The 1st Cavalry Brigade was directed to protect the left flank of the enveloping forces as they turned from south to west. Southward advance towards Warsaw would resume once the forces in the newly created Mlawa pocket withdrew or were neutralized. Meanwhile, the 4th Army crossed the Berda River on the 2nd. The expected Polish defense at the river line failed to materialize, but the advance was held up nonetheless as the motorized units of Guderian's 19 Corps advanced beyond their supplies of fuel and ammunition. This dangerous situation was not exploited successfully by the Polish defenders, however, and German supply columns made their way through to the stalled-out tanks. German gains in the corridor had cut off the Polish 9th and 27th Infantry Divisions as well as the Pomorska Cavalry Brigade behind a barrier of troops across the base of the corridor. All 3 of these formations were destroyed in attempts to break through the line to the south. On the next day, 21 Corps, in front of Grudziądz, made its move on the heavily armed town. The Poles had their 16th Infantry Division holding the city, and their 4th Infantry a short distance to the east. Shortly before the 21 Corps began its advance on the town, heavy Luftwaffe attacks concentrated on the 4th Infantry and succeeded in disorganizing that division and eliminating the threat of a blow on the left flank. With heavy artillery and air support, the Germans broke the resistance of the 16th Division and stormed into the town. Rearguard units fought tenacious delaying actions in the streets and enabled the two shattered divisions to retreat in relatively good order to the southeast. Meanwhile, 1 Corps and Corps Roderick broke into the fortifications at Malawa and forced the Poles to evacuate the area. On this day, also, von Bock sent some of Army Group North's reserve on an advance across the center of the remaining territory of the corridor, just below Danzig. This is led by the newly raised 10th Panzer Division, which pushed across the corridor and into East Prussia. The 207th Infantry, following behind, turned northwards midway in the corridor and pressed the Polish forces remaining in the corridor north towards Gdynia and the coast. Other elements of 4th Army occupied the rest of the corridor and linked up with 3rd Army at Neuenberg, or Nowe Swiecke. From here they turned south to attack the Polish 15th Infantry Division, which was deployed north of the town of Bydgoszcz. The link-up of 3rd and 4th Armies ended the initial phase of the campaign in the north. The corridor had been cut and the Reich reunited with their eastern Prussian province. Polish Pomorze Army had been destroyed, and the Modlin Army thrust out of the strong position of Malawa in disarray. A small enclave of Polish territory on the Baltic coast, fortress of Westerplatte, and the harbor of Danzig remained, all under constant attack from air, land, and sea. For their part, the Poles did launch a limited attack into East Prussia along the province's eastern frontier. This was carried out by the Podlaska Cavalry Brigade drawn from the Narrow Group, achieved some small local successes against the light forces of Corps Brand holding the area. The most significant effect of these minor Polish successes, however, was to furnish ammunition for the German propaganda line that Polish aggression was responsible for the beginning of the war. While the Germans were accomplishing their initial objectives in the north, another major effort was moving forward in the south. Here the weather was clear, unlike in the north, and thus Rundstedt had the benefit of aerial reconnaissance. 3 armies prepared to make for their initial objectives. The 8th Army, the northernmost of Army Group South's formations, would advance on Lodz. This would protect the flank of 10th Army, which would employ its strong mechanized components in an advance in the direction of the capital. 14th Army, on the right flank, would move into Polish Silesia and Galicia towards Krakow and the principal centers of Polish industry. By 0600 hours on the 1st, some of von Rundstedt's troops had pushed 4 miles into Polish territory. Little resistance was presented to the invasion anywhere until 1400 hours, when the oncoming Germans encountered bridge and roadway demolition that slowed the advance. Elements of the Wolinska Cavalry Brigade, covering the withdrawing Polish border troops, engaged the Germans in numerous rearguard actions, but no serious opposition was encountered. By late afternoon, some of Army Group South units had advanced as much as 15 miles into Poland. Everywhere along the front of 8th and 10th Armies, Polish formations facing them were withdrawing. Polish 10th Infantry Division, part of the Lodz Army, was retreating in the direction of Kalisz and in front of the 8th Army. Elements of the Poznan Army, namely the 14th and 25th Infantry Divisions and the Wielkopolska Cavalry Brigade, also drew before this force, towards the northeast. Opposite 10th Army were identified elements of the Krakow and Lodz armies, all withdrawing eastwards. These units included the 7th, 28th, and 30th Infantry Divisions and the Krakowska and Wolinska Cavalry Brigades. None of these units fought any protracted actions against the Germans. The fighting that took place consisted of rearguard actions such as roadblocks carried out by cavalry and infantry detachments. In the fighting of these first days, the new shape of mechanized warfare that the Germans had been developing in their exercises, largely on the basis of their battle experience during the 2.5-year involvement in Spain, took shape. These tactics were built around the flexibility and mobility of their armored and motorized units. When an obstacle such as a roadblock or strong point took the German columns under fire, held up the advance, tanks and other all-terrain vehicles would deploy off the roads and continue the forward movement, either silencing the opposition themselves or bypassing it for infantry and artillery to deal with. When necessary, the advancing formations would call upon the Luftwaffe, who on short notice could deliver devastating dive bombing and strafing attacks. This combination of mechanized assault and close air support was sometimes referred to as blitzkrieg tactics. These methods would also be used by the forces of 14th Army, who ran into some more formidable resistance on the first day. This was encountered in the Jablinka Pass, which is held by troops of Krakow Army's 21st Mountain Infantry Division. After hours of severe fighting, the Poles were pushed out of the pass. The Germans advanced several miles north, clearing the area of Polish troops. Elsewhere, the Germans encountered elements of the Rizau Armored Cavalry Brigade and drove them from the area around Novi Targ, Neumarkt. Meanwhile, reconnaissance troops and Slovakian infantry units crossed the Slovak border and occupied a zone immediately north of the frontier populated by villages claimed by the Slovaks. These advances in this area threatened to cut off the bulk of the infantry deployed to protect the city of Krakow and the industrial region. The 5th and 6th Infantry Divisions were compelled to fall back on the city, while the 2nd Infantry Division was pushed to the northeast of the town. By late afternoon, troops of 14th Army's left flank were confronting the strong permanent fortifications on the approaches to the mining region in the city. The next morning, intensive operations were resumed at 0600 hours. Polish defense was stronger this day. Heavy combat broke out at Mikoło, and the obstinate resistance was encountered in the fortified area around Katowice and Czestochowa. On the right flank, 8th Army forced a crossing of the Prosna River, and the 10th Army reached the Warta River upstream from Czestochowa. This day saw similar stubborn local resistance in the 14th Army area. The German divisions here continued to advance, making for a junction at Novi Targ. The Polish appeared to be withdrawing to hold a line behind the Warta River. It was clear they intended to remain in the fortress zones of Katowice and Czestochowa for as long as they could hold them. As the Poles moved east, they carried out an increasing number of demolitions and roadblocks, creating delays and keeping German engineers busy. This had been anticipated in the German plan, as we've seen, and a large number of construction and engineering units had been included in the provisions of Plan Weiss. These proved of great value in this advance. Every moment counted, for the Polish mobilization was proceeding, and already units composed of reservists, amounting to nearly 2 divisions, had appeared in front of 8th Army. Several infantry divisions drawn from the Polish active duty reserves kept in readiness behind the border armies were dispatched to deploy across the presumed axis of 10th Army's advance. The Polish defense line cracked the next day, however, while their forces were still in a disorganized state. Battered by aerial and artillery bombardment, coordinated with the assaults of armored and motorized infantry, the Polish defenders, already worn out from 2 days of retreat, were crushed by the relentless blows of the oncoming German war machine. Czestochowa fell on the 3rd after a desperate defense. Elements of the 10th Army seized a number of bridgeheads across the Warta. 14th Army broke through the fortifications around Katowice and Mikoło on the right flank of the German advance and opened the way into Galicia, then continued to push east along the river Vistula. This rapid advance put the Polish armies in the south at grave risk of envelopment, and compelled them to begin a hurried retreat to the east. On the 4th, the advance of Army Group South continued. Headquarters intelligence considered that the Polish Poznan Army, on the right flank of 8th Army, was withdrawing and incapable of mounting a counterattack from the northeast. The mechanized forces of the 10th Army had all but destroyed some of the Polish units facing them, including the 7th Infantry Division of the Krakow Army and the decimated Krakowska Cavalry Brigade. The panzers continued to press forward throughout the day, moving beyond Radomska and reaching the Pilica River. Meanwhile, to the south, 14th Army completed the destruction of the Polish 6th Division. The rest of the Polish army in the south was rapidly moving in the direction of Krakow or to the east in order to escape encirclement. In the 14th Army sector, 22 Corps was made operational with a Panzer Division, a light mechanized division, and a mountain division and advanced towards Novi Targ. The 18th Corps, from which these troops had been taken, was sent further east and given the 2 new mountain divisions on the right flank of the advance. On the 5th, the 3 German armies made further gains. As 8th Army advanced eastwards, the front held by 10 Corps, on the extreme north end of the Army's line, became more and more extended. Troops of the 4th Frontier Command, along with elements of the 62nd and 252nd Infantry, were formed into an ad hoc command known as Kampfgruppe Geineth, moved forward to hold the gaps. Though the Poles in general appeared to be on the run, the Poznan Army, on the other side of 10 Corps' extended flank, had not been as heavily engaged as the other Polish forces in the western provinces and still constituted a significant threat. The main advance by 10th Army was across the Pilica on the 5th. Before them lay the central Polish plain and the road to the capital. Poles were putting up a stubborn defense in front of the capital, but the reserves had been committed and little remained to bolster the defense. 14th Army was past the border defenses of the fortified zone of Polish Silesia. The mobile forces advanced into Galicia and towards the northeast, surrounding the industrial center of Krakow. The infantry formations of 8th Corps advanced on the city itself. 22 Corps, moving northwards from Slovakia between the mountains and the Vistula, headed for the valley of the San River. Resistance was beginning to intensify as the Germans moved forward in this sector, however, as the Poles had succeeded in regrouping some of the forces from the withdrawn southern armies and putting them into line. Further east, a new front was opened up in 14th Army Sector as the 18th Corps, employing the two newly arrived mountain divisions, pushed into Polish territory from Slovakia via the eastern passes of the Carpathians. On the 6th, the advance continued, and the Germans considered an attack on 8th Army's left flank by the still largely intact Poznan Army, likely enough to send two infantry divisions from the Army Group South Reserve to strengthen the north-facing flank held by 10 Corps and Camp Group Againath. However, the Poznan Army, which was threatened with encirclement by the advances of 10th Army mechanized formations, launched no attacks. 8th Army, along with the 10th, continued the northeastwards drive against increasingly intense opposition. The panzer units of 10th Army were in constant action. Those on the northern flank of 10th Army met and defeated heavy Polish counterattacks on that front launched by infantry drawn from the Polish reserve formations. Elsewhere, the mechanized forces, supported by ground attack aircraft and artillery, pushed forward, probing for weak points. Particularly stubbornly defended positions would be pounded to bits by the Luftwaffe or simply bypassed. Cut off in reinforcement and supply, these would then be methodically ground down by the following infantry and artillery behind the armored spearheads. In the south, a major victory was achieved with the capitulation of the vital city of Krakow. The remnants of the Krakow army, as well as the other forces in the southwest, were known to be concentrating in the region of Radom, to the northeast of Krakow and about halfway to the capital. Other Polish formations drawn from the units of the Lodz and Poznan armies were rallying near the city of Lodz. These concentrations of troops presented prime targets for enveloping movements. This is exactly what Army Group South was ordered to do. 8th Army was to move against the Lodz pocket, while 10th Army was to surround the Radom pocket while continuing its advance to the Vistula beyond. Meanwhile, 14th Army was ordered to send its armored and motorized forces on a rapid advance beyond the Radom pocket to the city of Lublin. By this means, the Germans intended to trap any Polish forces which succeeded in getting away east of the Vistula. By the close of the 6th of September, the first phase of the advance in the south was concluded. Of the Polish armies confronting Army Group South, the Poznan Army was relatively intact but in danger of encirclement and in retreat eastwards. The Lodz Army was under heavy attack near the city of Lodz. The Krakow Army had been shattered and reduced to retreating remnants, and the Carpathian Army, like the Poznan Army, basically intact but rapidly withdrawing to escape encirclement, in this case in the direction of Lublin and Lvov. Of the destroyed Polish divisions, many men were still in the field, surrounded and fighting doomed defenses against the German infantry. Thousands of others had already surrendered. The Poles had also had to commit most of their reserves in an attempt to stem the advance of von Rundstedt's armies on the capital. While the ground armies were accomplishing the first phase of their advance, the Luftwaffe was fighting a parallel campaign in the air. The first objective of the Air Force was the destruction of its Polish counterpart, and attacks on Polish air bases were in fact the first hostile moves against the Poles in the campaign. Bases in the capital and in the important towns along the western border were repeatedly hit, as well as satellite fields and dispersal fields. The Poles expected a blow of this kind, and relatively few of their aircraft were present on the targeted fields. They later rose to the defense of their skies very aggressively, mounting repeated bombing attacks on German columns and one raid into East Prussia. Polish fighters, however, were outclassed compared to their German counterparts, and as a result they soon lost control of their own skies, and the modern and effective bomber formations were only able to operate for about 3 days before being destroyed on operations. Polish Air Force activity altogether was impossible after this time, except in the vicinity of the capital, where fighter resistance was maintained for a few more days. Polish planes would still appear after the first few days elsewhere in the country, but these were reduced to operating in 2s and 3s from improvised landing strips, with no overall coordination and no logistical support. Once the Poles were destroyed in the air, the Luftwaffe turned to its main strategic purpose, support of the ground force. Dive bomber units provided on-call close support, usually flown from bases near the front. Stuka pilots would fly perhaps a dozen missions a day, striking frontline targets a 10-minute hop from their landing strips. Most of the fighter units, released from escort duty, joined the Stukas in a ground attack role, striking with small bomb loads and ground striking attacks. These close support missions were controlled and directed by Luftwaffe officers integrated into the ground army formations, who would communicate with the aircraft by radio. The medium bomber force turned to attacks on the Polish transportation system, striking the railroad network and highways, interdicting the movements and concentrations of Polish troops. Close air support of this kind was instrumental in maintaining the momentum of mechanized advance and in reducing permanent fortifications, such as those in the border area facing 10th Army's line of advance, which were struck repeatedly on the first day. The Kriegsmarine, meanwhile, played only a small part in the invasion. Most of the ships were disposed towards the west to meet the threat from the British and French. Only the old battleships Schleswig-Holstein, which assisted the siege of the Westerplatte fortress in the harbor of Danzig with bombardment from her heavy guns, and a handful of light forces and submarines were retained in the Baltic. These were employed in a blockade of the port of Gdynia. And there, with the end of the first phase of operations, is where I'm going to end this episode. I hope you found some of what I had to say here interesting or useful. I'm really enjoying putting this series together, so I hope you're enjoying it too. Next time, we'll bring the story to its crisis point and examine the operations that resulted in the total destruction of the Polish military. So I hope you join me for that. After that, we'll begin to look at the Rif War that was fought in the Spanish Protectorate of Morocco in the 1920s, and the early career of the Tercio de Extranjeros, or Spanish Foreign Legion. The unit itself, as well as many of its officers, would go on to play major parts in the Spanish Civil War. Next episode will probably not appear for a couple weeks, as next week I'll be on vacation in the Smoky Mountains, and mostly off the grid. We were going to go to Sequoia and Kings Canyon in California this year, but canceled that due to the pandemic, so we'll have to save that one for next year. So I hope to see you again after that, unless I run into a bear. And until next time, I remain Mark 7, wishing you all the best.